took me to thinking more about the component processes that might underlie the formation of social bonds. And what I'm going to talk about today is a series of studies that we have done exploring two of these component processes that I believe plays a major role in formation of social bonds. One of these processes is mimicry, and the other is reward processing as such, particularly social reward processing. What I will lay out in the next hour or a little less than that is a theoretical framework as well as a series of studies that explore the links between reward and mimicry and how these links might have implications for understanding autism. So the first stage is really to kind of understand what do we mean by social bonds or rapport. I mean, these words, just like the other word, the C word, consciousness, it's very easy to talk about it and everybody kind of knows what it means. But once we start to try and define it, it becomes quite tricky. Rapport seems to be a similar case where I was hoping that I get a very nicely circumscribed definition of rapport, but I couldn't find one, so I relied on the dictionary, where rapport is defined as mutual understanding between persons, sympathy, empathy, connection, a relationship characterized by these. Uh, that is hardly a scientifically acceptable or testable definition, but here is the broad picture. Now, the key hypothesis or the key suggestion that I'm going to make here is I'm going to suggest that mimicry and reward processing are essential components of rapport formation. And then I'm going to talk about autism as a case in point, where many individuals on the spectrum often face difficulties in forming rapport. The second part of the talk, which is the bulk of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the mechanisms, how I have gone about testing this framework that I lay out first between mimicry and reward. In the first set of studies, I'll talk about how reward influences mimicry. So we change the reward value associated with faces and see its impact on mimicry. And then in the second set of studies, I will change the extent of mimicry associated with those faces and see how their reward value gets changed and how these links between reward and mimicry are influenced by autism or autistic traits is something I'm going to talk about alongside. Finally, after going through the empirical studies, I am going to invoke David Marr and talk a little bit about the theoretical implications of this model of rapport that that I've been thinking about. So, what is this model of rapport? And again, if you have to disengage at this point, I've kind of got used to uh, talking to undergraduate students who disengage very early. So please excuse my standard practice here. This is the point that I want you to get across. This is what I'm going to talk about in the next several slides. The putative mechanism of rapport as a bidirectional cycle between reward and mimicry. Now, this is not necessarily a new idea. So one of the things that has been known for a long time uh, based on social psychology studies is that mimicry and liking or affiliation processes have bidirectional links. If I like somebody more, I will tend to mimic them more. And if somebody mimics me more, I tend to like them more than another person who does not mimic me that much. There are also various flavors of this body of work. There's a series of studies on in-group, out-group mimicry. So people generally tend to mimic in-group members more than out-group members. People generally tend to mimic others who they think highly of or are in a hierarchical, are in a higher social position than themselves, than others. But all of these studies effectively are manipulating either in groupness or liking or a social hierarchy. One could think of all of these things as manipulations of reward. So if you are an in-group person, you are more rewarding to me, and then I might be mimicking you more. If you are if you are in a socially higher position than I am, you might be more rewarding to me because I might get something from you at some point. So you might become more rewarding to me at that in that way. So those social psychological studies have been studying these bidirectional links between reward and mimicry for a long time. But in most of these studies, mimicry is often measured in a very macroscopic behavioral way. That would be postural mimicry, mimicry of tone of voice, and various things. So that has a slightly wider time window, and it's much more kind of real world measurements of mimicry than the type of mimicry measures that I'm going to talk about with facial electromyography. Um, so social psychology offers this first set of clues on the role of mimicry and rapport by showing bidirectional links between mimicry and liking or affiliation. And then there is clues from developmental psychology. One of the most well documented sets of behavior in parent-child interactions, early parent-child interactions, is reciprocal mimicry. And that is believed to play a crucial role in development of rapport. And that's work by Lynn Murray and others. But it is not restricted to parent-child or caregiver-child interactions as well. It has been shown even in third parties or adults or other children who are not necessarily biologically related to the child being tested, even when third parties are interacting with the child in a way that one adult is mimicking the child more compared to another adult, the child tends to affiliate more with the mimicking adult compared to the non-mimicking adult, and so on and so forth. So the clues from developmental psychology also suggest this strong links between mimicry and reward that might be underlying what we call rapport. And this brings me to autism, which is diagnosed in according to the DSM-5, using criteria that involve um, problems with social emotional reciprocity, and also, and this is, I'm quoting the DSM-5 here, that they often experience difficulties in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. Um, all of these are very much related to what I was talking about in rapport formation. So these, the fact that individuals with autism often, many individuals with autism often report difficulties in formation of social rapport. This is consistent with the diagnostic criteria definitions that are there in DSM-5. But beyond anecdotal accounts as well as diagnostic criteria, there are also very interesting clues from these putative underlying processes. We have talked about these two sets of underlying processes, one based on mimicry, and there is quite a lot of evidence on atypical spontaneous mimicry in autism. Now, this is a crucial word here, is spontaneous. So it is not as if that if individuals with autism are asked to mimic deliberately a given action, that there would be a strong group difference in how well they mimic another person. But it is often whether these mimicry relevant mechanisms are brought online in a real life situation in as much as they are brought online in neurotypicals. That is what most of the evidence suggests is that spontaneous mimicry, particularly spontaneous facial mimicry, is atypical. So atypical here refers to either reduced in magnitude or delayed in time compared to neurotypicals. And the other line of evidence from autism suggests that there might be atypical processing of social rewards. So social rewards here refers to faces, voices, and uh, things that would involve social interactions as well. Now, again, the DSM-5 says absence of interest in peers as one of the features of autism. But in more lab-based studies, what we have found and many others have found is autistic individuals or children and adults or children, sorry, often demonstrate a reduced interest to looking at social rewards compared to non-social objects. So these are kind of the initial clues in suggesting that mimicry and reward might be linked bidirectionally and underlie social rapport, and suggestive clues from autism that each of these individual processes, mimicry and reward response to social stimuli, might be atypical in autism. Now, that brings us to our first empirical question, which is we wanted to directly examine the links between reward and mimicry by manipulating one process and testing its impact on the other. And we were specifically asking, does reward modulate the extent of spontaneous facial mimicry? And does the extent of this reward-driven modulation of mimicry vary as a function of autistic symptoms? To do that, we use a very simple experiment to change the reward value associated with faces. The original task was developed by Ingrid Johnsrud, and this one we adapted for changing the reward value of faces. This is a card game. Effectively, you can see one of the cards and you cannot see the other card. And participants are told that you have to guess whether the card that you cannot see, whether that has a higher or a lower value, lower number than the one that you can see. And if they guess right, then they win 25p. If they guess wrong, they lose 20p. And they're also told that when you're playing this game, you would see faces. These are neutral faces that will pop up on the screen. Keep paying attention to the faces because there will be a memory game on the faces later on. Now, this goes on for a while. And as you can possibly guess, this game is completely rigged. That is, some of the faces people will win many more times compared to some other faces that they will lose many more times. And then there are faces, these are foil faces effectively, that are associated with intermediate levels of winning and losing. Now, after the card game is over, then in the test phase, people are shown videos of those positively and negatively conditioned faces, such as these. So these videos are taken from the mind reading set developed by Simon Baron-Cohen. And while people are watching these videos, we are recording facial EMG. So we are recording from the zygomaticus to provide an index of the extent of mimicry. Now, what was our first set of findings that kind of set off this entire program was that high reward faces were being mimicked significantly more than faces associated with low reward. This is zygomaticus activity on the y-axis and the time on the x-axis. This result, while this is not surprising in its own, but it did offer one a technique that was previously not used very much to look at this links between mimicry and reward. So as I said, many of the previous social psychological studies were looking at mimicry at a more macroscopic behavioral level. So this kind of boiled down the reward conditioning to specific using a evaluative conditioning task, followed by a kind of muscle specificity in the extent of mimicry being measured. So um, we were very focused on specific muscles here. And when we looked at uh, the sample that we had studied, we split them by autistic traits. What we found is that individuals with high autistic traits did not really discriminate much in terms of the extent of mimicry for high versus low reward faces. But individuals with low autistic traits showed significantly higher mimicry of the high reward faces compared to the low reward faces. So there was definitely an interaction going on. And then, but this study did not have any individual with a clinical diagnosis of autism. This study was done entirely in, in a neurotypical sample with autistic traits being measured from them. So we were asked the obvious question that do we get the same kind of results as what we see in the individuals with high autistic traits when we actually invite individuals who have a clinical diagnosis of autism? And this is what the data from 27 autistic adults looks like. This is the extent of mimicry for high reward faces, and this is the extent of mimicry for low reward faces. And I'm not presenting the statistics here because I think it is pretty clear that they're very, very similar. One thing that I would point out here is that there has been a possibly somewhat mistaken notion in the literature on that people with autism do not show facial mimicry at all. That you can see from here that if they did not show any facial mimicry at all, that would correspond to a value of 1 here. So this is the the extent of mimicry during the trial divided by the pre-trial baseline. What you see is that that is not true, that individuals with autism are showing mimicry all the same, but it's the reward dependent modulation that is not being seen here. So that is the key message that I want to get across from this slide. Now, uh, then the second one, so the second study that we did was um, did the same conditioning experiment as before outside the scanner. And then in the scanner, we present the test phase stimuli. So high reward faces and low reward faces making facial expressions of happiness and anger. And what we find is, and what we were particularly interested in was the coupling or functional connectivity between two clusters. One of these clusters, this is a cluster centered in the ventral striatum that we found from a meta-analysis of reward processing studies. And the yellow cluster is a cluster centered in the IFG. This is again drawn from meta-analysis of mimicry studies. So what we are looking at is the extent of coupling between these two regions when people are looking at high reward and low reward faces that we have conditioned them to. And what we find, first, we find that there is greater coupling in relation to high reward faces compared to low reward faces, and that this extent of coupling is inversely proportional to autistic traits. So individuals who are high in autistic traits have a weaker link between the IFG and the ventral striatum. We then followed it up with a study including individuals with a clinical diagnosis of autism. So again, just as before, the previous study was only neurotypicals with autistic traits, and this time we have got individuals with a clinical diagnosis, and we find that for individuals with autism, there is a group difference in how active in the activity of the inferior frontal gyrus cluster to high versus low rewarding faces. So this is the mimicry relevant cluster that I talked about. This is the independently driven, independently defined cluster in the IFG. that we find was responding less to the high rewarding compared to the low rewarding faces in individuals with autism. And this pattern it was not seen in the neurotypicals. So this summarizing this set of studies, what we found was effectively three things. So this was the EMG study showed greater mimicry of rewarding compared to non-rewarding faces. The fMRI study showed greater coupling of IFG and striatum, ventral striatum in relation while watching high reward versus low reward faces, and the strength of coupling was varying as a function of autistic traits. And the other study that I did not talk about, we also did an EEG study exactly with the same design, where the conditioning was down outside the before the electrodes were put on. And then we looked at the level of mu suppression for high reward versus low reward faces. And what we found was that there was greater mu suppression in relation to the high reward faces compared to the low reward faces. So these were some of these initial findings that helped us move forward. But at this point, my postdoc, Serena Panaciti, asked two important questions. One is uh, whether the reward to mimicry effect is specific only for faces, and maybe there is something special about happy faces and it doesn't generalize. And the second one, which is a more crucial one in my view, is whether the evaluative conditioning effect is weaker in people with high autistic traits. So maybe the individuals with high autistic traits or the individuals with a diagnosis of autism, maybe they are not associating, they're not learning the reward value of faces as done in that card game task. And therefore, any effect that we see that the reward value is not modulating the effect of the magnitude of mimicry, that is that is actually just downstream of the reward learning difference. So there are two experiments that we did at that point. The first, excuse me, was done by Anthony Haffey and others, where instead of faces, now we conditioned hands, and we conditioned, these are kind of human hand silhouettes, and we conditioned one hand with a positive, with the win outcome, and another hand with a lose outcome, or high. So basically, we have a high reward hand and a low reward hand, very similar to what we did with the faces. And then in the test phase, instead of measuring spontaneous mimicry, what we were measuring was a slightly subtle variant of spontaneous mimicry, which we have called that automatic mimicry, where this paradigm is something that was popularized by Celia Hayes and colleagues, where what you see is a hand on the screen that is either closing or opening up, and you are told at the beginning of the block that in this block your job is to close your hands every time you see anything on the screen, irrespective of what the hand on the screen is doing. And the philosophy is that if the hand on the screen is doing exactly what you are supposed to do, so let's imagine it is closing your hand, then you'll be quicker at it than doing something incongruent. So the congruent minus incongruent, the time it takes to do a congruent versus an incongruent task, is the extent of automatic mimicry. Long story short, what we found was that the for individuals who are high in autistic traits, sorry, this AQ should be under the x-axis, not on the y-axis. Apologies for that. So for individuals who are high in autistic traits, they showed they showed little difference between how much they mimicked the high reward versus low reward hands. So whereas individuals who are low on autistic traits, they showed a greater mimicry for a high reward hand compared to a low reward hand. So effectively answering the first question of whether the results that we see on the reward dependent modulation of mimicry, they are not specific to faces. So this is just but one test of effector generalizability, but I mean, one should test other effectors as well. The second question is on, does the conditioning work? So to test this, what Serena did was to do the same conditioning task using the card game as before, and then instead of testing mimicry, what she tested was an implicit association task. And again, those of you who might not be familiar with the IAT, it involves pairing, uh, giving a certain reward, a positive or a negative value to a certain stimulus. And then if you're pairing a positive stimulus with a positive word, you are quicker to respond to it than if you pair a positive stimulus with a negative word, and vice versa. So what the IAT did was to show that that individuals were generally much slower at responding to incongruent pairings, which is where a positively conditioned face would be paired with a negative word or vice versa, than when the pairings were congruent, which means a positively conditioned face was paired with a positive word. That's all fine. That just means that conditioning is happening as one expects it to. But this difference between congruent minus incongruent is what we took as an as a proxy metric for the strength of conditioning. So if it was true, what Serena had hypothesized, that uh, individuals with high autistic traits were just not learning the rewards enough or quickly enough or strongly enough, then what we would expect is that for high autistic individuals, this metric of congruent minus incongruent would be very small, and for low autistic individuals, this would be very big. That is not the case. We fit a linear model to it, and what we find is that strength of conditioning was not related to AQ. This is just the beta, and we've plotted the data here as well. Um, so in summary, in looking at the reward to mimicry, that direction of studies, what we find, and this is using the direct reward manipulation, which is the card game task through the evaluative conditioning, we've found it that with EMG, fMRI, EEG, and behavior, we have found that changing the extent of reward associated with faces or hands changes the extent to which they will get mimicked. And then, but the, card games are not really ecologically valid ways of thinking about reward manipulations. So if we think about indirect types of reward manipulations as well. So one of the ways that we've also examined it is manipulating eye contact. So this was a study that we did with Leonard Schilbach and others, who developed a very nice method of designing uh, an interactive avatar which either engages in joint attention with the participant or does not. So this is eye tracking and EMG simultaneously happening. And what we found was individuals high in autistic traits showed much lower impact of joint attention on facial mimicry compared to individuals lower in autistic traits. So very similarly to the reward-based modulation of mimicry, we see this impact of joint attention, the impact of joint attention on facial mimicry. And again, Leonard and others have argued that joint attention can serve as a reward signal. That's one kind of indirect reward manipulation. And also, Antonia Hamilton's group has been looking at the impact of eye contact on mimicry for using a series of studies over the last several years. And they have also reported, both using fMRI and behavior, that changing the amount of eye contact associated with certain if there is direct eye contact, that gives rise to greater mimicry compared to when there is lack of eye contact. And especially in relation to behavior, autistic individuals did not show this eye contact dependent modulation of mimicry. So that is all very consistent with the reward to mimicry set of studies that I've just talked about. In the second set of empirical studies, excuse me, I wanted to examine the question from the other direction. And this can be asked in two different ways. Um, for today's talk, I'm just going to talk about whether being mimicked is rewarding. And is the reward response to being mimicked influenced by autistic traits? The other way of asking this question is the act of mimicking itself rewarding? If anybody is interested in it, I'm very happy to talk about it after this talk. But right now, I'm just going to focus on being mimicked as a phenomenon. To examine this in a similar kind of systematic way, this is the paradigm that we came up with. So this paradigm was designed by Janina Neufeld, who has done many of these studies that I've been I've been talking about. She's now at the Karolinska, and this study effectively is structured like this. So you have a crosshair in the beginning, and then you see a word which is either happy or sad. And moment you see the word, you have to make a happy expression or a sad expression, as the case might be. And we are checking whether you are moving the right muscles, because we have put uh, EMG electrodes on the relevant muscles. And while you are making that happy expression, the this person in the video, there is a jitter in there, either starts making the same expression or makes the opposite expression. So this is the general setup. Now, what the act of mimicry conditioning. So this is essentially our mimicry conditioning experiment. It is designed in a way that this particular stimulus individual will be mimicking you 90% of the time. Another individual will be doing the opposite expression 90% of the time, and then there are two other foils as well. Just very similar to the card game. Only thing what we are conditioning is the act of being mimicked. And in the test phase, we are looking at preferential looking. So we the philosophy is that if you are presenting these two neutral faces side by side, then if people find one of these faces to be more rewarding, they would look at it longer. And we do this preferential looking once before the mimicry conditioning starts, and then after the mimicry conditioning experiment has taken place. So if this individual has mimicked you 90% of the time, and this individual has done the opposite 90% of the time, then we should see the difference in the preferential looking phase that happens after the conditioning. And this is what we find. So we calculate the gaze bias for each of those phases. The gaze bias is calculated in favor of the mimicking individual. So what we see is that before the conditioning, the gaze bias is around 1, which would mean both faces are preferred fairly equally, whereas after the mimicry conditioning, individuals prefer the mimicking face much more than the other one. Now, the one reason why what I didn't mention here in this particular paradigm is that when we asked individuals at the end of this experiment, what did you feel like? Many individuals did give the kind of a conscious and they were able to reflect on it and report that they felt that one of them was mimicking more and one of them was mimicking less. Um, and we have two other faces. They would mimic to different extents. Um, and as a function of being mimicked, the attractiveness of the faces, the ratings of the attractiveness didn't really change. Likability changed, or self-reported likability changed a little bit, but not as much as gaze bias. And we also found that um, the gaze bias towards the mimicking face varied as a function of trait empathy. So this is also if you to make it consistent with the previously reported stuff, this is the social component of the autistic traits is more akin to trait empathy, but it is in the opposite direction. So higher trait empathy means lower autistic traits. And what we found was that higher trait empathy was associated with greater gaze bias towards mimicking compared to non-mimicking faces. We then did this study in individuals with and without autism. And what we found, and again, very similarly, we conditioned the mimicking and the non-mimicking faces through the standard behavioral paradigm that I've just described. And then in the scanner, people were presented one face at a time. And what we are interested in is the response of the clusters that are involved in reward processing. This is from the meta-analysis that I've described before. So ventral striatum and orbitofrontal cortex were the regions we were particularly interested in. What we found was that there was reduced ventral striatum to mimicking compared to non-mimicking faces in autistic individuals. So this is in gray, and the black boxes are neurotypicals. For some reason, we observed it only in the left ventral striatum and not in the right. We do not know why that may be the case. And here is the same data plotted as a function of AQ across ASD and neurotypicals. What we found is that on the y-axis is the ventral striatum response to mimicking versus non-mimicking, and on the x-axis is AQ, and there is a negative correlation. Excuse me. Now, in summary, what we found was that if individuals were being mimicked using the mimicry conditioning paradigm, then then mimicking faces were associated with greater reward value compared to non-mimicking faces, and this also had a group difference in the ventral striatum response to mimicking compared to non-mimicking faces when comparing autistic with neurotypical individuals. We also had so actually, on the left is the studies from our lab. On the right is studies from other labs, which have shown that if adults were mimicking other children, or even other adults for that matter, they were associated with so mimicking adults were associated with greater reward value compared to non-mimicking adults. But these studies by Hale and Carpenter et al., they were all looking at postural or kinematic mimicry, whereas we were looking at facial mimicry conditioning. But these are all very consistent in the message that they provide. Now, so this brings me to the reminder slide. This is one of the slides that I started with, that there's a bidirectional link between reward and mimicry. Now, mimicry has been talked about as a social glue in many accounts, and the one addition that I would like to propose is that it's for mimicry to function as a social glue, it's the link with reward that really drives this social rapport, and that these links might be atypical in autism. In the final few slides, I just want to uh, take a slightly theoretical perspective and think about how these links might be offering useful insights for understanding autism. And in that sense, I want to invoke David Marr. And this is one of my favorite analogies, that if the fundamental aim for me is to make a cup of tea, that could be the computational level of explanation. Then the steps that I undertake in terms of getting a tea bag, some sugar, and boiling the water is algorithmic. And finally, the exact sequence of muscles that I move to prepare the cup of tea is the implementation of it. So there are different levels at which we can explain, or we can think about the mechanism. So when we think about these bidirectional links between reward and mimicry being atypical in autism, one way to think about it would be the computational level. At the computational level, the reduced social reward responsivity might be might offer an explanation. What might underlie the reduced social reward responsivity? I'm not getting into it right now, but we can imagine that if a child finds the caregiver to be somewhat less rewarding, uh, then the child might engage in lower degree of or not, might not have the equivalent degree of modulation of mimicry because the reward values from the social stimuli are lower to begin with. That in turn would mean that the child is mimicking less and is resulting in the child's reward value becoming weaker and the rapport formation being affected. So the reduced social responsivity reward responsivity could potentially offer one computational level uh, explanation for the kind of results that I'm looking at. This is particularly for the for understanding autism. Now, then, if we think in terms of algorithmic level, for me or for a child to detect that it is being mimicked, it needs to integrate information from a range of sensory streams. It would be so that would involve uh, vision, auditory, as well as proprioception in some ways. So if there are if this information is not being integrated in an appropriate at an appropriate time, and if that would have an impact on difficulties in detecting the act of being mimicked. And if you cannot detect equally well that if you're being mimicked or not, that would potentially have an impact on how rewarding the other person becomes over time, over a series of developmental interactions. If you do not integrate the sensory information equally well, that might lead to atypical rapport formation. And finally, the implementation level. And this is something that has been studied extensively in autism. The atypical connectivity in autistic brains that now is believed to arise from differential expression of synaptic genes. That might be the hardware differences that underpin the the links between these reward processing and mimicry relevant regions of the brain. So that's the level of explanation at the implementation level. And in summary, I just want to talk about how reward and mimicry share a bidirectional relationship, which can underlie rapport, and atypical links between reward and mimicry associated with autistic symptomatology. And I finished with a speculative account of these links, how they can help us understand the mechanisms underlying rapport formation with insights for autism. I just want to thank my lab members, um, especially all the volunteers and their families. And this is just work that I've done over the last 7 to 10 years. And of course, I'm incredibly grateful to my former group at the Autism Research Centre, particularly Simon Baron-Cohen and others. And thank you.
You can join me in thank you, Bhisma, for a great talk. And I open the virtual floor for questions. You can type your questions in the chat, and Bhisma can read it. Or if he doesn't, I can read for him. You can unmute yourself and ask a question. And if you're really, really shy, you can send me a private message via the chat, and then I ask the question anonymously. So, yeah. it's open for questions.
Tristan, shall I stop sharing my screen?
I think you can leave it, because if there's a question specific
Sure.
on a point, definitely. Yeah. There's a question that I missed from early on about a technical aspect that Matthew is asking. Can you see
Well, we're kind of past that point. Don't worry about it.
I thought so, but I just found it because I had so many private ones.
Sorry, I couldn't. I can't see the chat for some reason. Let me just try and find it.
If not, when there's a question, I'll tell you anyway. Okay. Oh, everybody very, very shy. If there are no questions, I've written 7 questions, but I didn't want it to be the first one to ask a question. I'll ask you a simple one, and then we'll see if that triggers the discussion. I was thinking in some aspect of the strategies that people with high EQ or ASD use to navigate social situations, and I was trying to apply the idea of the reward and mimicry into those situations, the compensatory strategies. But I don't think my mind goes that far. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about this sort of applied aspect of the concept into a real situation.
So I'm just trying to make sure that I understand. So you're saying mimicry as a compensatory mechanism. How does that work for individuals with high autistic traits or low EQ? Is that?
So we know that the autistic individuals or ASD individuals have compensatory mechanisms to navigate social situations. Quite a few of them, even express them, explicitly. And the question is whether the reward mimicry sort of conceptual framework can help understand those strategies.
I see.
Yeah. Sorry, that was better.
Yeah, no, I think that's. I mean, one thing that I would think about is that kind of compensatory mimicry is very deliberate, and the crucial difference in the kind of with the kind of mimicry that I have talked about in this set of studies is spontaneous, and that is where the difference lies. So if I would imagine that if I did not have to think, let's frame it this way, that if I had to think about every episode when I should mimic or should I not mimic. So if all of mimicry was deliberate, then it would be very exhausting for me. So I have to constantly monitor it, and which is why many autistic individuals often report that they're camouflaging effects or this trying to fit in with following mimicry as a social rule, that they find it to be fairly exhausting. So but they can do it very well. So which is why I think that deliberate mimicry is not really affected, and autistic individuals do routinely navigate the social world very well with deliberate mimicry. But because it is often not spontaneous, that is why it's exhausting. That's the way I look at it.
Okay, so I'm willing to stick my neck out with a question.
Go, Matthew.
Well, thanks, Bhishma, for that lovely tour. And I'm just wondering, what is it about the connection between mimicry and reward that is special, or is it special? I mean, obviously we notice it more because we notice social disruptions the most as social animals. But people with autism report all kinds of these kind of separations in cognition, between intention and action, between senses, or between separate elements of perception. So what is it about this breakup between mimicry and reward that that differentiates it from all these other disruptions of sort of cognitive coherence in autism?
Well, thanks for that question. I think it's not special in any way. It's just how it's special that in the impact it has. So I think you can have various types of dissociation like the ones that you mentioned, but whether all of those different types of dissociation have an equivalent impact on social bond formation, I would not know. And I would like to believe that particularly for social bond formation and particularly for, say, early parent-child or caregiver-child interactions, if mechanisms of reward response to social stimuli and if mechanisms of spontaneous mimicry, if these are not playing ball, so to say, if these are not tightly coupled and modulating each other, that might have an impact on the quality of the social relationships that are formed, and not just in early development. So the short answer is the dissociations are not particularly surprising, but the impact it has on social relationships, I would imagine, is what makes it interesting.
Very good. I think we're on the same page, my friend.
Any more questions or clarifications or whatever? I see some people are muting. Kieran?
Hiya. One thing that's brought to mind for me is the question of known spontaneous mimicry in autistic individuals, especially stuff like echolalia. So I guess the idea here is that, I mean, it's a spontaneous mimicry, but it's done in a very mechanistic way that doesn't really help with these kind of like positive social situations. I would like to hear like some thoughts on that, if that's all right.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. It's a very interesting question. So I think echolalia is, I mean, it is debatable whether echolalia should count as spontaneous mimicry. It is repetition of a certain kind of stimulus, either it's a vocal stimulus or a postural stimulus or whatever it is. Primarily, it is a auditory stimulus that we're talking about. And repetition of that particular phrase, completely unconnected to the actual social interaction. That's one thing that this is quite different from spontaneous mimicry in that context. But the most parsimonious definition that I can think of that separates out echolalia from spontaneous mimicry is the time window. Generally, spontaneous facial mimicry or spontaneous mimicry of other kinds, they usually happen within a very short time window, usually within 2 seconds, 2 to 3 seconds. Echolalia is something that not just, I mean, typically it takes place not just close to the actual stimulus, but for a long time thereafter. So echolalia can happen as a repetitive behavior. So I would imagine, and this is my hunch really at this, that echolalia has more to do with repetitive behavior and just the fascination with the sound contours than the reward value of the social stimulus who is generating that sound. That would be my view. That echolalia, even though they have a surface level similarity with mimicry, I would argue that it is not mimicry.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
I see there's a question in the chat. Shall I read it out, Tristan?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So there's a question from Yizing. Thanks for, if I remember correctly, the evaluative conditioning task, how rewarding faces are determined with value of monetary reward they can bring to participants. Could it be? Oh, yes. Could it be, or has there been any evidence that ASD individuals do not value monetary reward as much as typical individuals? Now, if very good question, and if that were the case, and we did consider that, and this is that experiment with the implicit association task, if that were the case, that individuals with high autistic traits did not really care about money, in that case, in the IAT, we should have found that they would be responding to the high reward and the low reward phases very similarly, because the money, winning money or losing money didn't make a difference. But that was not the case. We found that the conditioning effect, the magnitude of the conditioning effect, was unrelated to autistic traits. And this is not just our work in relation to this particular study. Even there was some work by Sylvie Johnson almost a decade ago now, showing that reward conditioning experiments, and this is a more formal reward learning type experiment, did not really differ between individuals with and without autism. And this is reward using monetary rewards as well. So while it is possible that the value of money might be different in different individuals, we would like to believe that it does not differ in a systematic way to to confound the group differences that we have got with the mimicry stuff.
I have a private question here. So if so is there's a deficit in reward processing from social stimuli? So is this sort of something that the relationship between the mimicry and the essentially, if it's something, the relation between reward and mimicry, it's only for social cues and social aspect, or if something that could be generalized in ASD? That's a good question.
That's a fantastic question. So we actually tested this, and I didn't get a chance to go through those results. So in the Haffey et al. Paper in 2013, where I showed you the hand mimicry, the automatic mimicry of rewarding versus non-rewarding hands, we also had a condition with robotic hands. So we conditioned robot hands with high reward and robot hands with low reward. So these are robotic hands are basically like clamps, metallic clamps that you can see in silhouette. And what we were absolutely puzzled by, it's there in the paper, that none of these autistic trait impact on mimicry was seen in relation to the robotic hands. The effect is specific to human hands. We haven't done this with robot faces or kind of other objects, but we would like to believe in light of that particular result, that this is specific to human or conspecific stimuli. But thanks for the question. Great one.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I had a question about your take on the ventral stratum as a modulator of reward, and whether there is an aspect of pharmacological modulation that you think would make sense in these cases.
Well, I mean, yes, of course, but I always kind of preface these responses with, alas, I'm a human researcher. So ideally, if I want to make a pharmacological manipulation, one would want to specifically block dopaminergic receptors that are that are involved in the connections between the striatum and the frontal and the prefrontal cortex. But those, I do not know whether there are pharmacological agents that do it specifically, or rather than kind of block every dopamine receptor that it finds itself on. So then I don't know how to infer from there. But in theory, yes, if we could selectively block the reward related, so the mesolimbic dopaminergic system receptors, that then one would imagine that it would have an impact in the extent of mimicry and effectively social bond formation. Now, I do not even know whether these circuits would be similar within rodents and humans. So if we were to do this in rodents, there are some studies by Andreas Olsson and others on rodent mimicry, but that's mostly looking at fear contagion rather than the kind of mimicry that we're looking at with humans and Zygomaticus. But this would be an interesting rodent experiment to block the reward system and have a measure of mimicry related phenotypes. I mean, it is known that if you block the reward system, the social behavior in general deteriorates in rodents. That's very well established, whether it's cannabinoid receptors or opioid receptors, that at least the neuromodulators of the mesolimbic dopaminergic system. But what is not known, as far as I know, is what's the impact of blocking those receptors on mimicry relevant behaviors.
Yeah, I was just thinking on all of the comorbidities, or the type of, cocktails that some doctors and some people in different, places of the world give to ASD individuals, which is of course very concerning. But at the same time, there might be cases that, have a look into the literature, just occurred to me during your talk. There might have been some sort of natural experiment, that can sort of tell us something about that particular question. So the question of causality at the dopaminergic system into this idea of the reward/mimicry. I'm sure this is not well controlled in any sense, but
I mean, the other line of kind of interesting experiments comes from Parkinson's disease, but that is also problematic in some ways because the levodopa type drugs, they are not just working on the reward system, but also involved in the movement control aspects of it. So if you increase the level of dopamine being produced in the brain, then you would see greater amount of mimicry, but not just that's possibly also because your motor system is working better at this point. So we'll have to kind of uncouple the impact of the dopamine receptor activity or activity of these pharmacological agents such as levodopa, uncouple their impact on the motor system versus their activity on the reward system per se. So that becomes quite a challenging aspect.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I'll give you one or two more questions if people are willing. If not, I'll let you all go to your drinks, wherever it is that your drink of preference on a Friday night. Any more questions or comments? Or if not, I'll ask you can join me in thanking Bhishma again. Thanks, Bhishma, for coming.
Thank you.
It was a tour de force, and I learned a lot instead of just cherry picking some papers and trying to understand the idea. So that was great. Don't be surprised if you get more emails of questions, etc. Because
of course, please. Yeah.
I had a lot of sort of comments in the private ones. I think there are a lot of shy people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.